Welcome to the channel. In this one, the protagonist never raises her voice, not once in the entire arc. She does not confront, she does not expose in a dramatic boardroom scene. She builds something so permanent that they can never enter it. That is the only move worth studying. This is Eternal Diary. Celeste Huang always knew a room by its smell before she knew it by its light. The 43rd floor of the Meridian Group headquarters smelled like recirculated ambition. A blend of laser printer toner, the faint ghost of someone's reheated lunch drifting up from the break room below, and the specific metallic cold of air conditioning set 4 degrees too low because the men in corner offices ran hot. She had identified that smell on her first day, 11 years ago, when she had stepped off the elevator as a junior financial analyst, clutching a portfolio of work samples she had revised 43 times. She had stood in the corridor for exactly 6 seconds, breathing it in, and told herself, I will learn this building the way a locksmith learns a lock. She had every mechanism, every chamber. The desk arrived on a Tuesday in October, 3 years into her tenure, when she had just been promoted to Director of Financial Planning. She had not requisitioned it through the office management system. She had bought it herself, carried the purchase receipt in her blazer pocket for 2 weeks before the facilities manager finally agreed to let a personal piece of furniture occupy company space, and she had stood in the elevator bay watching 2 contractors wrestle it off a dolly and into her office with the focused attention of someone watching surgery. It was walnut, not oak. The distinction mattered. Oak was what people bought when they wanted to look like they had taste. Walnut was what people bought when they actually had it. Darker, denser, with a grain that ran in long, uninterrupted lines if you selected the right cut, which she had, spending 40 minutes in the showroom tracing her fingers across 6 different slabs until the grain under her right palm felt like the answer to a question she hadn't yet articulated. The surface was sealed with a matte finish, not gloss. Yet gloss reflected the room back at you. Matte absorbed it. She had installed a false bottom in the left lower drawer herself on a Sunday morning when the building was empty, using a kit she had ordered from a specialist joinery supplier. The compartment was 4 centimeters deep, enough for a USB drive, a folded document, a small notebook. She had sealed it with a neodymium magnet latch, the kind used in high-end cabinetry. To open it, you pressed the lower left corner of the drawer's interior with your thumb and rotated the drawer insert 45 degrees. She had done this alone and told no one. The desk was not sentimental. It was architectural. It was the physical expression of a decision she had made when she was 23 and working a second job on weekends at a tax preparation firm to pay off her student debt. The only space that is truly yours is the one you build yourself, with your own specifications, as on your own terms. 11 years later, they gave it to Vivian for her bedroom, not a spare office, not a conference room, her bedroom, specifically as a vanity table for a converted penthouse apartment on the bund that Aldous Lau, founder, controlling shareholder, and a man who wore his power the way lesser men wore cologne, densely and without occasion, had purchased for his daughter as a 30th birthday gift. Vivian had apparently admired the desk during her introductory tour of Meridian's offices, the tour where she had been shown around as the incoming chief strategy officer while Celeste walked 12 feet behind them in the corridor, holding a tablet with Q3 projections that nobody asked her to present. She heard about the desk from Marcus, the facilities manager, who told her with the careful, neutral expression of a man who had learned not to take sides in situations he could not predict the outcome of. He said, "The desk in your old office, the walnut one. Miss Vivian requested it moved to her residence. Mr. Aldous approved it. I wanted you to know before the movers came." He paused, and in that pause, Celeste understood that he was giving her the opportunity to protest so that he could document having told her. She did not take it. She said, "Thank you, Marcus. Make sure they wrap the legs properly. The veneer on the bottom of the right rear leg is fragile." He blinked. She walked back to the open-plan workspace she had been assigned after her office was reallocated. Her office, the one with the windows she had watched the Huangpu River from for 9 years. The one where she had spent 6 months building the financial model that had allowed Meridian to secure a 4.2 billion yuan credit facility from 3 domestic banks simultaneously, the model that was still being used, with her name quietly removed from the header. And she sat down at a shared desk between a 25-year-old associate who ate chips audibly and a printer that hummed at a frequency that felt personal. She opened her laptop. The screensaver was a photograph she had taken from that window. The river at 7 in the morning on a winter day, gray and silver and completely indifferent to everything happening on its banks. She stared at it for a long time. Then she closed the screensaver and began working. The demotion had been architectural rather than announced. No termination letter, no conversation. Meridian simply stopped including her in meetings, then stopped including her in the meeting invites, then issued Vivian a direct report structure that overlapped perfectly with Celeste's existing remit, creating a redundancy that anyone reading the org chart could see but that no one in HR addressed because the org chart had been drawn by someone who understood exactly what they were doing. She had spent 31 days in the open plan workspace. During those 31 days, she had documented everything she could without arousing attention. Kate kept her expression professionally neutral through 16 interactions with Vivian that ranged from oblivious to condescending, and eaten lunch at her desk from a container she brought from home because the 43rd floor cafeteria felt like a theater she no longer had a role in. On the 32nd day, they offered her a consulting arrangement. The consulting arrangement was described in a 2-page letter that had clearly been drafted by someone in legal and then softened by someone in HR, producing a document that had the structural confidence of a legal notice and the apologetic hedging of a breakup text. The terms were an 18-month retainer at 60% of her current salary, no access badge beyond the lobby level, no parking allocation, no benefits continuation, no title. Oh, and a deliverable structure that amounted to being available when Vivian's team got confused about something and needed someone who had actually built the system they were now operating. She read the letter once. She noticed that the retainer would be paid through a separate entity called Meridian Advisory Services Limited, which had been incorporated 4 months earlier. She checked the public registry later that evening from her kitchen table with 2 registered directors, neither of whom was anyone she recognized. This was a detail she filed precisely, the way she filed all details that seemed administrative but were not. She signed the letter. She signed it because she needed the income while she made arrangements, and because refusing would have triggered a separation that would have required Meridian to calculate her redundancy package correctly, which would have required them to look at her employment history carefully, but which she had reasons for not wanting them to do yet. The last time she visited the 43rd floor was on a Wednesday in February. She had been asked to come in to walk Vivian's team through the financial model for a new development project in Pudong, a project she had originated, scoped, and begun underwriting before her office was reassigned. She signed in at the lobby security desk, received a visitor badge, red lanyard, not blue, and took the elevator to 43, where she sat in a glass-walled meeting room for 90 minutes, explaining her own methodology to 3 people who took notes with the careful attention of students who do not understand what they are being taught, but sense it is important. Vivian stopped by the meeting room at the 40-minute mark. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer over a silk blouse, and she held a coffee cup from a boutique roaster near Sintiandi. And she looked at Celeste the way one looks at a piece of furniture that used to be in a different room. She said, "Is this going well?" One of the analysts said, "Miss Huang is being very thorough." Vivian smiled the particular smile of someone who has never needed to be thorough and does not intend to start. She said, "Great, take good notes." And she left. Celeste watched her go. She felt the things she always felt in those moments. Not rage, which would have been easier and less dangerous. But something colder and more precise, the way a scalpel is colder and more precise than a hammer. She felt the sensation of having measured something exactly. She finished the session at the 90-minute mark. She thanked the analysts by name. She rode the elevator to the lobby, handed her visitor badge to the security desk attendant, and walked out of the building into a February afternoon that smelled like rain that hadn't arrived yet. She had parked 3 blocks away because she no longer had parking validation. The walk took 7 minutes. It was the last time she would make it in one direction. The rain came that evening. Hard and sustained, the kind that the city got in February when the temperature couldn't decide what season it wanted to be. She drove home from a meeting with a former colleague who had wanted to discuss a potential role at a competing firm. The meeting had been vague and cautious and ultimately inconclusive, the way most things were in the period between when your professional life ends and when it officially ends. And the freeway was wet, and the lights of oncoming traffic scattered across the windshield in a way that made depth perception unreliable. She was thinking about the false bottom drawer. It was whether Vivian's people had found it, whether the neodymium latch had held, Whether the USB drive she had left inside it, which contained nothing sensitive, she had cleared it of sensitive material months ago. It contained only a single file, a spreadsheet of every financial model she had ever built at Meridian, clearly labeled with her name and the date of original creation, a record she had assembled as a quiet legal precaution, had been discovered or discarded. She was thinking about this when the truck came through the intersection on a red light. She did not hear it until the moment of impact, which tells you how fast it was moving. And then there was nothing. Not darkness. Darkness implies an absence that you are still present to observe. There was simply no more sequence. No more the next thing. And then the smell of the 43rd floor. Toner. Reheated lunch. Metal cold air. She was standing in the corridor. She was 26 years old. She knew she was 26 because she was wearing the blazer she had bought at 26. Charcoal gray, slightly too large in the shoulders because she had bought it a size up for professional authority in a body that had not yet learned what authority felt like in fabric. And because her hands, when she looked at them, were her hands at 26 with the small scar on her right index finger from a filing cabinet accident that she had forgotten about entirely until this moment. Which meant she had not thought of the scar in 8 years, and now here it was. A white crescent below her first knuckle, as precise as a signature. She stood in the corridor of the 43rd floor of the Meridian Group headquarters. It was a Tuesday. She had been told to report to the 43rd floor for new employee orientation. She was a junior financial analyst. She had revised her portfolio 43 times. She did not panic. She stood in the corridor for 6 seconds, breathing in the smell of the building, and said nothing. Her mind performed an operation that felt like a sorting, not the chaotic shuffling of someone confronting the impossible, but the deliberate categorization of someone who has too much information and needs to organize it before the information becomes noise. She was here. She was 26. She had 8 years of detailed professional memory and the specific, intimate knowledge of how this company operated, who made what decisions, who deferred to whom, where the money went that was not supposed to go anywhere, and exactly which provisions in Meridian Group's Articles of Incorporation would prove most relevant in the future. She now had the opportunity to not repeat. She had died because she had run out of moves. She would not run out of moves this time. The elevator opened, and a woman she recognized, Pei, from HR, someone who would later become the person who drafted the softened legal notice breakup letter, emerged and said, "Miss Huang, the orientation is ready." "Thank you," Celeste said. She walked into the building. The first thing she did differently was not dramatic. There were no scenes, no performances, no moments in which she revealed future knowledge in a way that would have made anyone around her uncertain. She had considered in those first few days how people in stories like hers behaved. The sudden, inexplicable competence, the mysterious smile, the knowing pause before delivering information that could not have been known. She rejected all of it, not because it was not satisfying to imagine, but because it was not efficient. Theater cost time. Silence was free. She worked. She worked in the same way she had worked the first time through her 20s. But this time, she worked with the precision of someone who knew which tasks would be remembered and which would be attributed to others. And she distributed her effort accordingly. She was excellent at the things that would be noticed and competent at the things that wouldn't be, and she was careful never to be so exceptional that she became threatening before she was positioned to absorb the consequence of being threatening. She opened a personal brokerage account on a Tuesday evening in October of that first Rebirth year, using a firm based in Hong Kong that allowed retail participation in domestic A shares with proper registration. She began accumulating Meridian Group shares in small tranches, never more than what her salary and savings could plausibly explain, bought across a 6-month window to avoid any concentration that might trigger disclosure requirements. She used her own name. She had thought about nominees, shell structures, beneficial ownership arrangements, and rejected them. She was not building something that would need to be hidden. She was building something that would need to be visible. At the exact right moment, with clean provenance. The shares were not the weapon. They were the standing. In Meridian's founding documents, she had read them fully for the first time 3 months after her death, in a public records office where she sat for 4 hours on a Saturday, going through original filings from 2003, Article 47, C permitted minority shareholders holding a combined stake of no less than 3% of issued share capital to petition the company's supervisory board for an independent financial review if they could demonstrate, with preliminary evidence, reasonable grounds to suspect a material breach of fiduciary duty by any member of the board or executive committee. 3%. She had run the calculation on her first morning back. At current share price, 3% of Meridian's issued share capital was achievable. It would take her 4 years at her current savings rate, purchasing consistently at market prices, to reach that threshold. She did not need to reach it alone. That was the second consideration. The second consideration was who else held Meridian shares and what their relationship with the Lau family was. She knew, from her previous life, 3 categories: institutional investors who held stakes for index exposure and had no particular affinity for the Laos, former management shareholders who had been diluted and displaced over a series of capital restructurings between 2012 and 2018, and 2 individuals, a retired engineer named Shenbo King, who had been a founding-era investor and held a 2% stake he had never sold, and a woman named Dai Jinfeng, who ran a family office in Qingdao and had inherited a 1.4% stake from her father. Celeste had known both of their names in her previous life. She had never contacted either of them. She had been too busy maintaining the structure that was collapsing around her to consider what might have been possible if she had looked at the architecture from the outside. In the second year of her return, she began the forensic documentation. This required precision that bordered on obsession, and she gave it exactly that. She was not documenting from instinct or suspicion. She was documenting from memory, which meant she already knew what to look for and needed only to find the paper trail that confirmed the shape she could already see. The fraud at Meridian was not complex in concept, though it was sophisticated in execution, which is true of most financial fraud. The idea is usually simple, and the mechanism is elaborate. Aldous Lau had been systematically inflating the appraised valuations on Meridian's development land bank since at least 2016. She had suspected this in her previous life, but had never had the standing or the specific documentation to prove it. What she had was the knowledge of which properties were inflated, by approximately how much, and which appraisers had provided the inflated valuations. Because she had personally processed the loan applications that were secured against those properties, and she had noted, in the way that people who work closely with numbers note things they do not officially report, that the gap between the appraisal figures and the comparable market transactions she had used for her own internal models was consistently and specifically in the same direction. Always higher, never lower, never random. That was not how legitimate appraisal variance worked. She began pulling public records, land registry filings, development approval documents, official government assessments from municipal planning authorities, which were publicly available and which recorded a separate set of valuations for property tax purposes. These official tax assessments were, without exception, significantly lower than the appraisal figures Meridian had used for bank lending purposes. The gap between the 2 sets of numbers was not explainable by legitimate methodology. It was explainable by only one thing. She built a database. She did it on her personal laptop, which she had purchased new and which was not connected to any Meridian system. And she did it over the course of 14 months, working on weekend mornings between 6 and 9 a.m. when the air in her apartment was still and the city below was not yet loud. She cross-referenced 112 development properties across Meridian's portfolio. She identified 37 where the gap between the tax assessment and the bank appraisal exceeded 40%. She mapped those 37 properties against the loan facilities they had been used to secure. She traced those loan facilities against Meridian's consolidated accounts. Then she found the money. It was not difficult to find once she was looking in the right places. She knew where to look because she had spent 11 years at Meridian, and she had built the financial architecture of the company's domestic reporting structure, which meant she understood exactly which intercompany transactions were routine and which were structured to look routine. The money left Meridian through a sequence of legitimate-looking steps. First, as management fee payments to a series of advisory companies registered in Hainan, and then as service fee payments from those companies to 2 entities in the Cayman Islands. then as investment returns from those Cayman entities to a family trust registered in Singapore. She traced 3 of the Cayman entities to their registered agents using public company registries in the Cayman Islands, which were accessible online for a nominal fee. The registered agent for all 3 was the same firm. The beneficial ownership disclosures, which Cayman law required but which were not publicly searchable, were not something she could access. But she did not need to access them. She had seen the Singapore trust documents in her previous life briefly during a due diligence exercise for a transaction that had been abandoned. The trustee was a private trust company. The beneficiaries were listed as members of the Lau family and their descendants. She had not understood the significance then. She understood it now. The total value of the misappropriated funds, based on her calculation, was between 340 million and 480 million won. The range reflected genuine uncertainty in some of the older transactions, not sloppiness in her methodology. She kept this information in the database. She did not share it. She did not use it yet. In the 3rd year of her return, she registered a company. She did it on a Friday afternoon at the office of a business registration service in Jing'an. So while a clerk processed her documents with the speed of someone who handled 40 such registrations a week and found none of them interesting. The company was called Horizon Financial Advisory Company Limited. It was registered under her name as sole director and shareholder. Its stated business was provision of financial consulting, forensic accounting, and advisory services to corporate clients. She had selected the name without sentiment. Horizon because it implied distance and forward visibility. Financial advisory because it was accurate and appropriately broad. And she had considered and rejected 8 other names that were more evocative and therefore more memorable for the wrong reasons. You did not want people remembering your company for its name in the early years. You wanted them remembering it for what it did. Initial capital, 300,000 won, which was everything she had saved in 3 years of working at Meridian while living in an apartment that was functional rather than comfortable, in a neighborhood that was convenient rather than desirable, eating lunch from a container she brought from home. She had also, during those 3 years, taken and passed the CPA examination, the Securities Analyst License Examination, and completed a self-directed study of corporate law with particular focus on the provisions governing minority shareholder rights, fiduciary duty claims, and the evidentiary standards for securities fraud complaints to the CSRC, the China Securities Regulatory Commission. She had taken these examinations the first time through her 20s as well. She had allowed the credentials to be swallowed by the practical work of being good at a demanding job, and she had never used them fully because the infrastructure of Meridian had given her standing she did not need to construct herself. That standing had turned out to belong to Meridian and not to her, which was a lesson about the difference between borrowed shelter and a house you build yourself. She did not intend to borrow shelter again. The first client of Horizon Financial Advisory was a property developer named Wei Chongqing, who had been a former Meridian joint venture partner until Meridian had exited the partnership under circumstances that Wei had told anyone who would listen were not what they appeared. Celeste had known Wei slightly in her previous life. She had processed the paperwork on the JV exit and had noted, without pursuing, that the valuation methodology Meridian had applied to buy out Wei's stake was aggressive in Meridian's favor in a way that a less busy and less politically aware version of herself might have questioned more formally. She met Wei through a mutual contact at an industry association event she had specifically attended in order to encounter him. She was not calculating about it in a way that was visible. She was simply present, knowledgeable, and direct about her new firm's capabilities. Wei was 61 years old, had the specific kind of grudge that had been well maintained over 4 years, and needed someone to tell him whether what Meridian had done to him was technically actionable. She spent 3 weeks reviewing the documentation he provided. Then she wrote a 17-page memorandum that detailed, with footnoted legal authority, exactly what Meridian's valuation methodology had done, why it constituted a potential breach of the JV agreement's fair value clause, and what the procedural pathway for a civil claim would look like, including realistic outcome ranges. Wei paid her invoice without negotiation. He also introduced her to 2 other developers who had had uncomfortable experiences with Meridian. He did this because the memorandum was exactly what it appeared to be: thorough, technically precise, and written by someone who understood the specific operational details of how Meridian worked from the inside. And in a professional landscape where most advisors were generalists, specificity was a form of trust. Horizon Financial Advisory had 4 clients by the end of its first year, 8 by the end of its second year. By the end of its third year, Celeste was now 31 years old in this rebooted timeline. Managing a practice of 11 staff in an office she had leased on the 22nd floor of a building on West Nanjing Road. It had 32 clients, a specialist reputation in financial forensics and corporate dispute advisory, and a quiet waiting list. She had not yet touched the Meridian documentation. The timing was not random. She had mapped it in detail from her first month back. Vivian Lau's appointment as Chief Strategy Officer was announced in her previous life when she was 34, which meant it had been planned at least a year before that. In this timeline, Celeste was still at Meridian during those planning years. She had not left until year 3 of her return, when she had accumulated enough savings and enough client foundations to make the transition without the consulting arrangement, and so she had watched. With the particular neutrality of someone watching a play they have memorized, the early stages of Vivian's preparation being constructed around her, she left Meridian voluntarily. This was important. She submitted her resignation letter on a Thursday morning, walked it to HR personally rather than sending it by internal mail, and delivered it to Pei with the same professional composure she delivered everything. She served her notice period fully, meticulously, without incident. She completed every handover document with more detail than was required. She held training sessions for the 2 people who would absorb her responsibilities, and she was thorough and patient and left 0 gaps in the knowledge transfer. She did this for one reason. A voluntary and non-contentious departure meant she left as a former employee in good standing, not as a separated employee with a dispute. It meant she could, at the legally correct future moment, be positioned as a disinterested professional party rather than a grievance claimant. The distinction mattered for credibility. She was not suing Meridian out of bitterness. She was advising a client who had experienced harm, and that client happened to be herself in the form of a shareholder portfolio she had been building for 4 years. She crossed the lobby for the last time on a Friday afternoon in April. She did not look back at the building. Not because she had overcome anything, but because she had already extracted everything from it that she intended to take, and sentimentality was an indulgence that had no function in the architecture she was building. She did look at the security desk. Marcus was not there. Marcus had left Meridian the previous year, a fact she had noted with the particular warmth she reserved for people who removed themselves from proximity to what was coming. A younger man she did not know was manning the desk. He nodded at her as she handed in her access badge. She nodded back. Outside, it was the particular kind of April afternoon that Shanghai produces without effort. Bright, slightly hazy, the air carrying the faint mineral smell of the river 2 kilometers away. She stood on the pavement for a moment, not in drama, but in the purely practical pause of someone recalibrating. Then she hailed a cab and went to her office on West Nanjing Road, where she had a 4:00 call with a client in Chengdu about a valuation dispute she was 2 weeks from concluding. The following 6 months were the most technically demanding of her professional life in either of its iterations. The CSRC complaint was not a letter. It was a submission. 218 pages, structured according to the Commission's formal requirements for securities fraud referrals from non-regulatory parties. With 3 appendices totaling an additional 94 pages of supporting documentation and a separate technical annex of 67 pages containing her full forensic analysis of Meridian's property valuation practices, the intercompany payment flows, and the offshore entity structure, she drafted it over 5 months. She reviewed it with a lawyer she had engaged specifically for this purpose, a man named Ren Shuming, who specialized in securities law and who had a reputation for the kind of quiet, so procedurally impeccable work that did not generate press coverage until it was far too late for the subject to benefit from the absence of press coverage. She had identified Ren in her previous life as someone she wished she had approached but hadn't, for the same reasons she hadn't approached Shen Boking and Dai Jinfeng. She had been too deep inside the structure to see its exterior clearly. She engaged Shen Boking in year 4 of her return. She called his personal number, which was in the public directory because he was 83 years old and had never thought to remove it, and introduced herself as a financial professional who held Meridian shares and had some concerns she believed he might share. He was silent for a long time after she finished her preliminary explanation. Then he said, "Come to my house on Sunday. Bring everything." She brought the condensed version, 40 pages. He read it at his kitchen table while she drank tea that tasted like it had been brewed with water heated in a kettle that had not been replaced since the 1990s, which she found inexplicably settling. When he finished, he said, "I knew something was wrong. I did not know how to say it correctly." She said, "I do." He agreed to join the shareholder petition. His 2% plus her current holding, which had reached 2.2%, was 4.2% combined. She did not need Dai Jinfeng. But she contacted her anyway, because 5.6% was more visible than 4.2%, and visibility at the moment of filing was exactly what she wanted. Dai Jinfeng was 44 years old, managed a family office with the clipped efficiency of someone who had inherited wealth and refused to behave as though it were inevitable, and had what she described as a particular dislike of Aldous Lau that she had never articulated in any professional forum, because she had not known how to make it useful. She met Celeste in a hotel lobby in Qingdao. She read the condensed version in the same manner as Shen Boqing, completely in silence, with no visible reaction. And then she said, "What do you need from me?" Celeste told her. Dai Jinfeng agreed to everything within 24 hours. 5.6%. 3 parties. Clean provenance on every share. No nominee structures, no obscured ownership, no legal ambiguity about standing. Ren Shuming reviewed the shareholder petition documents separately from the CSRC submission, and his only substantive comment on the petition itself was that it was, in his assessment, the most thoroughly prepared minority shareholder filing he had reviewed in 14 years of practice. He delivered this assessment with the professional flatness of a man who considered enthusiasm a form of imprecision. They filed on a Thursday morning in October, 5 years and 9 months after Celeste stepped off the elevator into the 43rd floor for the first and second time. She was not in Shanghai when they filed. She had arranged to be at a client conference in Chengdu for 3 days, which was a real conference with real clients, and her presence there was documented and normal and had nothing to do with timing. Ren Shuming handled the filing. He sent her a single message when it was done. Submitted. She read it over a cup of bad conference coffee in a hotel corridor, her face showing nothing because her face had learned over 5 years to show nothing when she needed it to, and she finished the coffee and went into the session on valuation methodology in the infrastructure sector and paid attention. Because the session was relevant to a client engagement she was managing. The CSRC operated with the deliberate pace of a regulatory body that understood what speed communicates when the subject is a public company with retail shareholders. They did not move slowly out of inefficiency. They moved deliberately out of the understanding that the investigation needed to be airtight before the intervention was visible, and Celeste had designed her submission with this in mind. She had not given them a complaint. She had given them a completed preliminary investigation, a roadmap of what they would find and where they would find it, and the specific regulatory provisions under which each finding was actionable. She had, in effect, done their work for them. This was not altruism, it was velocity management. The faster the investigation concluded, the tighter the window between conclusion and action, and the less time Aldous Lau had to move assets or restructure the offshore arrangements. She had flagged this risk explicitly in the submission. Note that the Cayman entities referenced in Annex B are accessible to restructuring or liquidation with minimal procedural delay, given their jurisdictional structure. Time is a material consideration. The CSRC was not insensitive to time. Vivian Lau was formally appointed Chief Strategy Officer of Meridian Group on a Monday in February. The announcement was distributed to all staff via internal communication, and it included a photograph of Vivian standing in what had been Celeste's office in front of the walnut desk that had been Celeste's desk, which had apparently been returned from the penthouse apartment once the office renovation was complete. Vivian had commissioned a renovation of the 43rd floor executive suite, which was now decorated in a style that the internal announcement described as contemporary and refined. And the walnut desk, it seemed, fit the aesthetic well enough to be repatriated. Celeste saw the announcement because Meridian's staff communications were distributed through a public investor relations channel for significant leadership announcements, which meant it landed in a news aggregator she monitored as part of her standard market research. She looked at the photograph for approximately 4 seconds. The desk looked correct. The grain was clearly visible in the photograph, which was well lit, and the matte finish read in the image as the particular dark warmth she remembered. She wondered if the false bottom drawer had been found and dismissed, or found and not understood, or never found at all. She sent Ren Shuming a message. "Any update on timeline?" He replied within the hour. "I am told the preliminary review is complete." "Decision pending on next steps." She replied, "Thank you." 3 weeks later, the CSRC issued a formal investigation notice to Meridian Group. In the framework of securities regulation, an investigation notice is not a finding. It is a procedural step that requires the company to preserve all documents and records, provide cooperation to investigation staff, and refrain from certain categories of financial transaction during the investigation period. It is not in itself a public announcement, but it requires notification to the stock exchange. The stock exchange requires disclosure within 1 trading day of a material regulatory event. Meridian stock fell 18.4% on the disclosure day. This was not because retail investors had read the investigation notice and understood its implications. It was because institutional investors had algorithms designed to respond to regulatory disclosure events, and those algorithms did not wait for implications. They responded to the category, and the category was regulatory investigation into a property developer following a minority shareholder petition related to valuation practices, which in the specific market environment of that period was a category that carried a particular weight. The weight was, this is the kind of thing that sometimes turns into the kind of thing you do not want to be holding when it resolves. Celeste held her shares through the 18.4% decline. She had calculated the expected price trajectory across 4 scenarios, and 3 of the 4 scenarios resulted in a recovery above her average purchase price within an 18-month window following the investigation's resolution. The 4th scenario required a full regulatory finding of fraud, which would suppress the stock permanently, but in that scenario, she would not be relying on share price recovery as part of her financial position. She did not make this calculation with cold satisfaction. She made it with the specific attention of someone managing risk, which is different from cold satisfaction in the way the surgery is different from cruelty. The exterior can look similar if you are not paying attention to the purpose. The investigation took 4 months. She was informed of its progress through legal channels. Ren Shuming was a named party in the petition and received formal updates, and she read each update with the care of someone who has built the map and is now watching the navigation. Aldous Lau attempted 2 things during the investigation period that Celeste had anticipated and prepared against. The first was a board resolution to increase the authorized share capital, which, if implemented, would have diluted the minority shareholders' percentage stake and potentially disrupted the standing threshold. The supervisory board rejected the resolution on procedural grounds, which they would not have done without the petition already in motion, because procedural grounds require someone to raise them, and someone needed standing to raise them. Ren Shuming raised them. The second was a negotiated settlement approach. Through an intermediary, Aldous Lau's legal team contacted Ren Shuming to inquire about a confidential resolution. The intermediary was a senior partner at a firm that did a significant volume of Meridian's M&A work, which was not a conflict that surprised her. She had expected the approach and had given Ren Shuming precise instructions: acknowledge receipt, request a written term sheet, take no position. The term sheet arrived. It was, in the specific language of corporate settlement documents, generous to the petitioning shareholders in terms of financial consideration, and entirely silent on the question of admission of wrongdoing. The consideration offered was approximately 40 million yuan in total, distributed among the 3 petitioning shareholders according to their proportional holdings. She read the term sheet, she read it twice, she noted the number. Then she wrote back, through Ren Shuming, "The petitioners are not seeking personal financial consideration." The petition was filed in the regulatory interest of the market and its participants. We are not in a position to negotiate a private resolution that would constrain regulatory proceedings already underway. This response was accurate. Once a CSRC investigation is formally initiated, It cannot be terminated by a private agreement between the subject and a complaining party. The regulatory process operates independently of the civil relationship. Aldislau's legal team either did not know this or knew it and was making the approach anyway in the hope that she did not know it. Either interpretation told her what she needed to know about how they were assessing her. The CSRC issued its findings in June. The findings were not public documents. Regulatory findings in Chinese securities law are communicated to the subject entity first, before any public action, but the stock exchange disclosure requirements attached to any material regulatory outcome meant that the outlines of the findings became visible within one trading day of the formal communication. Meridian disclosed, "The company has received a regulatory determination regarding certain property valuation practices used in historical loan applications. The company and its legal advisors are reviewing the determination and will provide further detail within the disclosure timeline permitted by applicable regulations." The stock fell another 22%. The formal public announcement came 6 days later. It named Aldislau specifically, as was required in cases where the finding referenced individual conduct by a board member. The finding described a pattern of systematic overstatement of appraised property values used as security for bank lending, across a period spanning 7 years and 37 identified transactions, resulting in unauthorized credit exposure to 3 domestic banks totaling approximately 6.7 billion yuan. It described the identification of a pattern of related party payments to offshore entities that had not been disclosed in accordance with listing rules, with a total value across the relevant period of approximately 410 million yuan. It required Aldislau to step down from all positions at Meridian and imposed a lifetime ban on his holding any directorial or senior management role at any listed entity in mainland China. It referred the matter to public prosecutors for consideration of criminal liability. The criminal referral was the element she had not built her model around, because she had genuinely not known whether the commission would go that far. It was the element she had flagged in her submission as a potential, but not a certainty. And she had written in that section of the submission with particular care because she had not wanted her analysis to appear to be lobbying for a criminal outcome. She was making a regulatory submission, not drafting an indictment. But the numbers, when you mapped them clearly and completely, had their own argument. The Meridian stock eventually stabilized at approximately 43% of its pre-disclosure price, which reflected a market assessment that the company was not terminally impaired, but was substantially impaired as a going concern under its current structure. The 3 banks began formal negotiations with the new interim board about the loan facilities. The interim board was appointed by the supervisory board after Aldislau's removal, which meant it did not include any of the individuals who had implemented the valuation practices, because the supervisory board, having read the regulatory finding, had the particular motivation of institutional self-preservation operating clearly in their decision-making. Vivian Lau was still CSO of Meridian for 6 days after the initial disclosure. On the 7th day, she issued a statement through a personal communications advisor that she had tendered her resignation to focus on personal and family matters. The statement was the kind of document that contains a maximum of information in the minimum of words and the minimum of honesty, and it was reported in the financial press with the specific editorial neutrality that major publications reserve for situations where the narrative is apparent enough that commentary is redundant. Celeste read the statement in the back of a car on her way to an 8 o'clock breakfast meeting with a new potential client, a fund manager who wanted a forensic review of a portfolio company's financial reporting. She read it once, she noted its language. Then she put her phone in her jacket pocket and looked at the city passing outside the window. Shanghai at 7:50 in the morning was a particular kind of alive. Not the frenetic aliveness of later hours, but the purposive aliveness of a city getting itself into position, traffic building in the disciplined patterns of a place that has learned to process enormous volume, construction cranes visible in every direction, the river surface catching the early light in a way that was different from winter light, warmer and more direct, the city throwing long shadows westward. She thought about the desk. She thought about it briefly and specifically, the way she sometimes thought about it, not with loss, but with the clinical interest of someone examining a specimen. The desk was currently, she assumed, still on the 43rd floor of a building whose executive suite was now occupied by an interim management team she had never met, in an office that Vivian Lau had vacated. It was a walnut desk with a matte finish and a false bottom drawer secured by a neodymium latch, and its grain ran in long, uninterrupted lines along the surface. And somewhere beneath the left lower drawer, there was a USB drive containing a spreadsheet of every financial model she had ever built at Meridian, clearly labeled with her name and the date of original creation. She had not retrieved it. She would not retrieve it. It was not there because she had forgotten it. It was there because she had left it intentionally, in the specific way you leave something in a room you intend to outlast. The car stopped at a light. Through the window, she could see the east face of a building she recognized, a commercial tower on West Beijing Road that she had walked past several hundred times and never entered, a building she had recently learned was coming to market in a partial stake transaction because its primary owner was restructuring his portfolio following a family office dissolution. She had been in discussions with 2 institutional investors about assembling a vehicle to acquire that stake. The discussions were at the term sheet stage. The building had 38 floors. She had identified the top 3, 36, 37, 38, as suitable for the expansion of Horizon Financial Advisory, which had in the past 6 months received 3 approach calls from competing advisory firms about potential combination transactions, all of which she had declined, not because the terms were wrong, but because the timing was wrong. So she had intended to be ready to move on a new space when the regulatory process concluded. It had concluded. The timing was now. Her phone vibrated. She took it out. It was a message from Shenbo King, who communicated exclusively by text message and used punctuation with the specificity of someone who had learned to type late in life and therefore gave each punctuation mark its proper weight. The message read, "Saw the news this morning? Thank you. My wife says you should come to dinner." She wrote back, "I would be glad to. Tell me when." The breakfast meeting lasted 90 minutes. The fund manager was considering whether to extend a bridge facility to a portfolio company and wanted an independent assessment of whether the company's receivables book was what it represented itself to be. This was a standard forensic engagement. She quoted him a timeline and fee, and he accepted both, back at her office on West Nanjing Road, the 22nd floor. The space she had leased in year 3, and which was now too small by a factor she had been tracking precisely for 8 months. She had 3 messages waiting from other financial journalists who had obtained her professional contact and were seeking comment on the Meridian situation given her historical association with the company. She responded to all 3 identically. "I am not in a position to comment on matters under regulatory review. Oh, I wish the company and its stakeholders well in the process of resolution." This response was simultaneously accurate, professionally appropriate, and completely uninformative, which was the exact intention. She had a conversation that afternoon with the lead investor in the building acquisition vehicle, a man named Linda Wei, who managed a real estate private equity fund with the particular style of someone who had spent 20 years in real estate capital markets and had arrived at the specific economy of expression that results when a person has explained complex things to many people for a very long time. He confirmed that the 3rd co-investor had committed, which brought the equity stack to completion. He said, "We should be in a position to sign the purchase agreement within 30 days. She said, "Good, I want the top 3 floors ring-fenced in the lease structure from the point of acquisition." He said, "The vendor will want market rent on them." She said, "I know, price them in." He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who understood that when someone said price them in with that particular quality of flatness, they had already done the calculation. He said, "All right." They signed the purchase agreement 27 days later in a conference room at the notary office on Huaihao Road, with a stack of execution copies and a ceremony that was legally meticulous and humanly brief. She signed every page with the same quality of attention, legible, consistent, unornamented, and then she stood and thanked the notary and the vendor's representative and took a copy of the executed agreement in a clear plastic folder and walked to the car that was waiting outside. The fight out of the top 3 floors began the following Monday. She had engaged an architectural firm that specialized in commercial interiors, and she had spent 2 half-days with the lead architect going through the spatial plan. She knew what she wanted and could describe it precisely, which the architect noted with visible relief. Clients who knew what they wanted were rare enough to comment on. She did not want statement design. She did not want the visual language of a company performing its own importance. She wanted a space that communicated capability through quality of detail rather than scale of gesture. The right materials, the right proportions, the right light. The desk she had ordered for her own office at the top of the 38th floor was not walnut. Oh, she had spent time with this decision. She had considered walnut for what it would mean, the resonance of it, the echo, and then she had set that consideration aside because the new desk was not a response to the old one. It was not a statement about anything that had been taken from her. It was simply a desk she had chosen because it was exactly what she wanted. She chose oak, a specific cut of European white oak, wide-planked, with a grain pattern that was broader and more varied than walnut, with a finish she had specified after reviewing 12 samples. Slightly warmer than matte, what the finisher called a soft satin, which caught diffuse light without reflections and gave the surface the quality of something that had been used well for a long time, even though it was new. She did not install a false bottom drawer. She did not need one. She had no secrets that needed to be stored beneath her workspace. The drawers were fitted with standard hardware. The desktop was clear. The building on West Beijing Road was not visible from the 38th floor. The building she could see from the window of her new office was the Huangpu River, from a vantage that was different from the 43rd floor of Meridian. Higher above street level, slightly more westward, so that the river bend was visible in a way it had not been from that other window. And the light on the water at 7 in the morning looked different from 38 floors on West Beijing Road than it had from 43 on the Bund. Not better, not worse, different. She preferred it. It was hers. Horizon Financial Advisory occupied the 36th floor fully and the 37th partially, with the remaining space on 37 reserved for expansion that she expected to fill within 18 months at the current growth trajectory. She had hired 6 additional staff in the 3 months prior to the move, bringing the total to 19, and she had promoted her most senior associate, a woman named Song Huiling, who had come to her firm from a Big Four accountancy practice 3 years earlier, and who had, without ever discussing it in those terms, become the person who ensured that the internal systems of the firm were as well constructed as the external work it produced, to Deputy Director of Forensic Services. Song Huiling had found the transition from accountancy to a forensic boutique initially uncertain and then absorbing, and then, in the period around the Meridian matter, something she described in a performance review conversation as the work I was actually suited to do without knowing it. She said this with a slight deprecatory shrug that suggested she was uncomfortable with the sentiment but felt it should be recorded. Celeste said, "I noticed it in your first year. I waited to see if you would." Song Huiling looked at her for a moment, and then said, "That is a very particular management style." Celeste said, "It produced the correct outcome." Song Huiling, who was 30 years old and had the specific sense of humor of someone whose precision made irony available to them without effort, she said, "I suppose I cannot argue with the evidence." The first year in the new offices was the year that Horizon Financial Advisory stopped being a boutique that people remembered from recommendations and became a firm that appeared in financial journalism as a named party in significant matters. This was partly the consequence of the Meridian matter. The regulatory finding had referenced the minority shareholder petition as the originating complaint. And the financial press had eventually identified Celeste as the petition organizer, which she had not attempted to prevent because the timing was no longer a consideration. The finding was public. The facts were public. Her role was public. She had ensured that her role was positioned as what it was: the documented, procedurally correct action of a qualified financial professional with standing rather than as a personal grievance, which it also was, but which was not the part that needed to be visible. She gave one interview to a financial publication whose senior editor she had assessed as rigorous. She said 3 things in that interview that were reported fully and without distortion. She said that the minority shareholder mechanism was a structural protection in Chinese corporate law that was underused because the procedural requirements were demanding and the outcome uncertain. She said that the evidentiary standard was achievable by any professional with the relevant expertise and sufficient document access, and she said that the purpose of the mechanism was not revenge. She said this word specifically, calmly, with the quality of someone who is not protesting too much, but is being accurate. but the protection of market integrity, which was a systemic good that benefited shareholders, creditors, and markets alike, not only the parties who initiated the process. Well, the interviewer asked whether she felt vindicated. She said, "That is not the right frame. The process produced an accurate outcome. That is what processes are for." The interviewer tried the question again from a different angle, asking whether the outcome felt personal given her employment history at Meridian. She said, "I was an employee of Meridian for 6 years. I became a shareholder after leaving, which established my standing to petition." These are sequential facts in the same biography. They don't require a more complex narrative than what they are. The interview was published under the headline, "The Forensic Accountant Who Brought Down Meridian Group's Patriarch." She had not provided the headline and had not seen it before publication. She read it on a Thursday morning over the same bad quality tea she had been drinking from the same brand of budget tea bags for 8 years in her kitchen, and she considered whether the headline's framing of "brought down" was accurate. She decided it was not quite accurate. She had not brought down anything. She had filed a document. The document contained an accurate accounting of what had existed. The bringing down had been accomplished by the actions of the people who had built the thing in the first place, and she was simply the person who had ensured that the accurate accounting was presented in the correct form at the correct time with sufficient precision to be actionable. She finished her tea. The 38th floor office on West Beijing Road had a quality she had not anticipated and had not designed for. Quiet. Not the absence of sound. The city was audible through the glass at that height. A constant low frequency that was more felt than heard, but a quality of interior acoustic that she had noticed on the first morning she used the space, before the staff arrived, when she stood at the window with a cup of tea and realized that the space did not hum. There was no air conditioning frequency, no printer hum, no proximity of 23 people simultaneously processing their days and their discomforts. There was the sound of her own thinking, which was a sound she had not had a space for in 11 years of an earlier life and 6 years of this one. She stood at the window for 11 minutes that first morning before her first meeting. She had nothing scheduled until 9 o'clock, where she stood and watched the river from this new angle, and she did not think about Vivian or Aldous, or the desk, or the consulting arrangement, or the red lanyard, or any of the 11 specific moments of humiliation she had catalogued with precision and held without sentimentality. She thought about the morning. She thought about the next 3 months of work, specifically and practically. She thought about a question Song Huling had raised in the previous week about the methodology for a new engagement involving cross-border asset tracing. She thought about oak grain and soft satin finish, and the particular quality of diffuse light on an uncluttered surface. At 9 o'clock, she walked to her desk and opened her laptop and began the day. Vivian Lau sent a message through a mutual industry contact 3 months after Celeste's interview was published. The message was transmitted through the contact, a man Celeste knew slightly from industry events, who called her on a Tuesday afternoon and said, with the careful tone of a man who understood he was delivering a communication whose reception he could not predict, "I have a message for you from Vivian Lau. She wanted me to convey that she would appreciate the opportunity to meet, at your convenience, to speak about a professional matter." Celeste said, "What professional matter?" He said, "She didn't specify." Celeste was quiet for 4 seconds. This was not uncertainty. It was the specific pause of someone who has already made a decision but is allowing the correct interval before communicating it. She said, "Please tell her that my schedule is closed for the current quarter. She is welcome to have her representatives contact my office to inquire about future availability." He said, "I'll relay that." She said, "Thank you." She ended the call. She did not call back with a softer version. She did not send a follow-up message. She did not wonder what Vivian had wanted to discuss. She had a clear understanding of what Vivian had wanted to discuss, advisory services, or a reference, or a relationship that might translate into something useful in the rearrangement of her professional life after Meridian, and she had no reason to offer any of those things, and no interest in occupying that conversation. Her assistant, a composed young man named Fang Wei, who had joined the firm 18 months prior and who managed her schedule with the organized intelligence of someone who understood that time was the resource that could not be recovered, sent a formal acknowledgement to the contact's office that same afternoon. "Miss Huang's schedule is closed for the current quarter." Inquiries regarding future appointments may be directed to this office beginning the 1st of next month. Fei Fangwei sent her a copy of the message as a matter of routine. She read it in her office at 5:40 in the afternoon, with the city going dark outside the window in the specific way it went dark in autumn. The river losing its surface light faster than the sky above it. She marked it read. She closed the inbox. She opened the document she was working on, a cross-border asset tracing methodology she was developing for a new category of engagement, a framework that Song Huiling would use to train the next hire, and she continued writing. The methodology was the work. The methodology was what mattered. The methodology was a system for finding things that had been moved, misrepresented, or hidden, using public records, legal filings, regulatory disclosures, and the specific vulnerability of financial structures that look complex but are ultimately constrained by the requirement to exist in the real world, where they must interface with banks, notaries, registries, tax authorities, and the approximately 700 other points of institutional contact that make money flow across borders, and that, in doing so, leave traces. Everything leaves traces. This was not a philosophical observation. It was a technical reality that she had built a practice around, and that the practice had proven consistently, across 34 completed engagements in the past 6 years, to be operationally reliable. A money that appears to vanish does not vanish. It moves through channels that can be mapped, and the mapping requires patience, precision, and the willingness to follow a thread for longer than most people find comfortable. She wrote until 7 o'clock. Then she saved the document and closed her laptop and put on her jacket and took the elevator to the ground floor and walked into the autumn evening. The building on West Beijing Road was lit from within. The way commercial buildings are in the hours after most of their occupants have left. A few windows bright on lower floors, the upper floors dark except for the cleaning crew moving floor to floor with the systematic pattern she had come to recognize from the sidewalk on the evenings she left late. The 38th floor was dark. Her office window was one of the dark ones. She looked at it for a moment. She was not sentimental about this either. She was just noting it. The dark window on the 38th floor of a building she owned a stake in, containing a desk she had chosen herself, for herself, with no false bottom and no hidden compartment, because there was nothing she needed to hide, nothing she needed to preserve against the possibility of being removed. You cannot be removed from the room you build and own. This was not a philosophical observation either. She hailed a cab and went home. The letter from the forensic accountant arrived at Meridian's interim board 6 weeks later. It was not her letter. She had had no contact with Meridian's management since her departure 6 years prior. It was a letter from the independent forensic firm the interim board had engaged as part of the regulatory remediation process, and it detailed the physical asset inventory of the 43rd floor executive suite, which was being documented as part of the board's review of all company assets. The letter was, in the ordinary course, not something she would ever have seen. She saw it because one of the interim board members was a client of Horizon Financial Advisory, not for anything related to Meridian, but for an unrelated personal holding matter. And he mentioned it in passing during a review meeting, with the specific quality of a person who mentions things, because he thinks they might be relevant to the person he is with. He said, "Your old desk is apparently still there." The inventory flagged it as a personal item with unclear ownership status because the original procurement records showed it was purchased by an individual, not by the company. She said, "It was purchased by me." He said, "The inventory team thought so but wanted to confirm. They found a hidden compartment in it, a drawer within a drawer. There was a USB drive inside." She said, "Yes." He said, "They reviewed it. It contained a spreadsheet. Your name was on it?" She said nothing. No, he said, "They'd like to return the desk and the drive to you if you want them. The board is happy to arrange transport. It's personal property." She thought about this for exactly 1 moment. Then she said, "Keep the drive. Destroy it properly. Not deleted, properly destroyed, physical destruction, and certificate of destruction." She paused. "You can send the desk to a charity that runs adult literacy programs. There's one in Yangpu that I know of. Ask if they can use a good desk. If they can't, find another organization. I don't have space for it." He looked at her. He was a man in his late 50s who had encountered a fair number of situations in his professional life and had developed the capacity to observe without comment when observation without comment was the appropriate response. He said, "All right." She moved on to the next item on their agenda. The oak desk on the 38th floor of the building on West Beijing Road was exactly where she had left it. The grain ran in long, broad patterns, irregular in the way of oak rather than the even discipline of walnut. The soft satin finish caught the morning light coming off the river and held it without reflection. The surface was clear except for a laptop, a single notebook, a pen, and a cup of tea that was, as always, too strong and not quite hot enough because she made it at the beginning of the morning and forgot it while she read. And by the time she picked it up, it had cooled to the specific temperature that was no longer ideal, but was still tea. She picked it up. She drank it. She opened the notebook. She had written at the top of a fresh page, the night before, a question she had posed to herself about the cross-border tracing methodology. Is there a category of institutional counterparty we are not currently treating as an evidentiary source? She considered the question. She wrote an answer. The answer was 3 sentences long and was followed by 2 more questions, which she also answered, and then a structural note about how to incorporate the new category into the framework she was building. She wrote for 22 minutes before her first call of the day. On the 36th floor, Song Huiling arrived at 8:14, earlier than most of the staff, and went directly to her desk and opened her laptop and continued the analysis she had been running the previous evening, which had not been there when she left, and was now there on the screen exactly where she had saved it, because nothing had moved it in the night. This was a fact that should be unremarkable, and was in the way that all genuinely stable things are unremarkable. Not because they are unimportant, but because they require no compensation. The office filled over the next 40 minutes. 23 people, at their correct desks doing the work that the firm was built to do, in a space that belonged to the firm, in a building that the firm occupied on terms it had negotiated for itself. Celeste's assistant confirmed the day's schedule at 8:45, 3 client calls, 1 internal methodology session, 1 prospective client meeting at 4 o'clock with a fund that was considering an engagement related to an LP dispute. She confirmed. She took the first call at 9 o'clock. The client was in Shenzhen, was direct and technically precise, and the call lasted 38 minutes and produced 3 specific action items which she wrote in her notebook in the same clear hand she used for everything. She ended the call. She wrote the date and time next to each action item. She drew a small square next to each one, as she always did, a box to check when the item was complete. Then she closed the notebook and looked out the window at the river, which was doing what it always did, which was move steadily in one direction. Indifferent to everything happening on either of its banks, and entirely reliable in its course. She picked up her tea. It was cold. She drank it anyway.